What's poppin', people? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. Well, we've got some breaking news at the top of the show. Turns out that U.S. government represents the interests of the rich and powerful, not the majority of Americans. Now, I know this may come as shocking news to you, but a joint study released last week by Princeton and Northwestern University made it official. The U.S. is indeed an oligarchy. The two authors of the study went through an enormous amount of data from 1,800 federal policies enacted between 1981 and 2002 and empirically concluded that national laws and regulations overwhelmingly align with the preference of the economic elite. And that was back in 2002. Hilariously, it took another elite institution, Princeton, to come up with this obvious conclusion. But hey, I guess the Ivy League school finally started to listen to Dr. Cornel West. Now let's break the set.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, we put something on the air. It's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait. Do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire untold. These ones are hard hitting, you watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set. Breaking the set. Breaking the set.
This month, the U.S. Congressional Budget Office announced their prediction that could spell major profits for the Department of Education over the next 10 years. $127 billion to be exact. It's a forecast based largely upon the interest on student loans, which are also expected to rise starting next year. While it's not exactly clear how much the rates will increase, the profit from federal student loans calls into question another important story. The Department of Education renewing its contract with Sallie Mae, America's largest student loan provider with about 5.8 million former and current student borrowers. See, the student loan behemoth has been the target of a federal investigation and lawsuit stemming from violations of borrowers' rights. But the probe wasn't limited to federal student loans. In fact, the investigation found evidence that Sallie Mae cheated active duty members of the military as well by providing them loans at illegally high interest rates. And if you've ever seen the PR machine of military recruitment, you know that cheap education is a huge selling point.
This is an acceptance letter. It's a diploma. It's a passport. It's a compass. It's a trainer and a coach and the jersey of the greatest team on earth. It's more than a uniform. It's an education you can't get anywhere else. There's Strong, and then there's Army Strong.
But Army Strong doesn't ensure that predatory loan corporations will follow the law. See, the Service Members Civil Relief Act specifically requires that companies collecting payments on student loans keep rates at no more than 6%. But get this, according to the Department of Education's own data, as of July of 2012, nearly 60% of all federal student loans carried interest rates above 6%. Furthermore, according to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, 41% of service members are still paying off student loans. And those who graduated college in 2008 carry an average debt of $26,000. This, of course, raises familiar concerns from the mortgage crisis, where higher interest rates led to the foreclosure of hundreds of homes belonging to U.S. servicemen. In that instance, however, lenders like J.P. Morgan and Bank of America, among others, were forced to shell out millions of dollars to settle the allegations. Look, it's one thing for young Americans to be lured into the military with a promise of a world-class education for practically no money down. But to then burden these young soldiers with tens of thousands of dollars in loans that could take the rest of their lives to pay off is criminal. In 2012, internet hacker and notorious troll Andrew Ornheimer, better known as Weev, was charged with conspiracy under the 1986 Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and was sentenced to 41 months in prison. And it was all for exposing a flaw within AT&T's public server, which led to the scraping of information for thousands of iPad users. But following a motion to appeal his sentence last month, the U.S. Third Circuit Court of Appeals has overturned the verdict on Weev's case because it was tried in the wrong jurisdiction. His short time behind bars, however, has made Weev even more outspoken than before regarding the egregious overreach of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act to persecute online activists. Well, earlier today, I caught up with Weev to discuss all things about his release. Let's talk about what the prosecution argued against your case that led to your guilty conviction. Assistant U.S. Attorney Glenn Maramaco said Weev had downloaded the entire iOS system on his computer. He had to decrypt it. He had to do all these things I don't even understand. Yet your defense attorney maintained that there was no hack that took place. You simply revealed a major security flaw at AT&T. How is it possible that you were able to be prosecuted by people that honestly had no idea what the hell it was you even did?
Well, that's a great question. At trial, there was one of AT&T's employees, R. David Halsey, and AT&T didn't instigate this indictment. The FBI did, and R. David Halsey's quote was, "No security was bypassed. I don't think the feds have a case." Like AT&T itself, the so-called victim, didn't think it was victimized and didn't understand why the FBI and the Department of Justice were trying to push an indictment. So. He was put on the stand, and Zach Trotter, who was the U.S. attorney who led his questioning, he said, "Are you a lawyer?" You know, as if lawyers are supposed to somehow be able to define truth in this country. It's positively ridiculous. We don't have rule of law in this country anymore. We have rule by lawyers.
Two-tiered justice, man, and you've been the victim of it. Do you think that your case is perhaps the most absurd example of overreach by the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act?
I think that there's some other parallels. I think Aaron Swartz, of course, and Matthew Keys are particularly egregious indictments that I just don't understand how this is supposed to be any modicum of justice.
Unfortunately, even though you're released right now, it's not for the right reasons. Weev, in fact, you're still on bail, will probably be tried again in another jurisdiction and potentially go to jail all over again. However, you've said that you're not going to file a motion for double jeopardy. Why?
Because this law is wrong. It's utterly and completely ridiculous. It was written in 1986, and it was drafted by Reagan's team. And there's, in a book, there's a quote from Reagan where he's so senile that he thought the movie War Games was a documentary. And he said, I don't understand, you know, but that kid hacked into NORAD, you know? And like, I went to prison, and 2 people so far have committed suicide over a crazy indictment, and Keys might go to prison, and Lostetter might go to prison because Reagan was senile, and that's just ridiculous.
Let's talk about your time in prison. You said that you spent half of your time in solitary confinement. Why did you initially get sent to the hole, and what sort of tactics were used against you psychologically to break you down once you were thrown in?
I was initially sent to the hole because, I mean, this case was about my speech, and I was sent to the hole because I continued to speak in prison. I had a PBX system, which is like a computer that answers phone calls. And I would call into it, and it would record my voice and post whatever I said to a web service called SoundCloud. And the federal government didn't like this, and they probably called down to the prison and told them to put me in the hole over it. I endured starvation. I have celiac disease. I require a gluten-free diet, which the prison for quite a while refused to provide. In the hole, you endure sleep deprivation. They shine a light in your face every 15 minutes. They bang on your door. They turn the light off when you want it on, and vice versa. And just general, you know, they wouldn't let me have books towards the end, or magazines, or newspapers, or any mail at all. I was literally in a 6x8 cell with nothing to read. And it's definitely trying, but it's not deterring me from continuing to fight this terrible set of prosecutions by the U.S. government.
Would you say that you were tortured in there? I mean, the solitary confinement is torture.
Towards the end, I went on a hunger strike. I was released after I started my hunger strike, and I just saw no way to protest the injustice and yes, potentially torture, definitely by what the UN calls torture, that I received in federal prison.
What's the most amusing thing that happened to you in prison?
There's so many things. I'd say that the funniest thing was I taught all the white nationalists to sing "Springtime for Hitler" from Mel Brooks, the producers, and then they banned that song in the prison because there's MP3 players. They banned that song because it became subversive.
You've announced that you're starting a hedge fund called Tro LLC. Love the name. Talk about the project and why you're doing it.
Well, the reason that I did the iPad data disclosure was because I started security firm Goatsy Security because there's a certain set of, and kinds of exploits that didn't have a market. And this actually is an underlying ethical problem in that right now the only incentives when you develop software exploits are to sell them in secret to the United States government and the security companies that are affiliated and funded by the United States government chiefly. And we know what they do with these software exploits. They use them to spy on people illegally, both the citizens of my country, foreign leaders. So what we're trying to do is build a way to create financial incentives for people to do the right thing, which is come forward and disclose to the public security issues in large corporations. And the way the profit model on this is every time that I've interacted with a major corporation, a publicly traded corporation, the share price falls. It hits the market cap, and that's the same with whether outside of software. If a car company has a defect in their cars, the stock value drops. If a medical company has pharmaceuticals that hurt people, the stock value drops, and it's absolutely perfectly executable on software companies too. When they have a flaw, we can drop the stock value by disclosing that flaw and telling people about it. And we want to create this structure where people can come forward, talk about the flaws in a very aggressive, criticizing manner instead of this diminutive do what the government says. And it's actually, the profit is far greater doing this potentially than the typical, sell your exploit to the NSA. I don't think hackers are being paid enough, and I don't think the consumers are being served. And there's a huge market here.
Andrew, where can people find out more about your case to help you out and to support you if and when it's reopened and potentially tried again?
They can follow me on Twitter. I'm Rabite on Twitter, R-A-B-I-T-E, and they can go to the CFAA Defense Fund, CFAADefenseFund.com. My attorney, Tor Eklund, is not only defending me on this particular case, but a host of other ludicrous CFAA indictments, including Derek Losetter and Matthew Keys, and people can submit money to him and read about the case. And he's a trench warrior, and he's fought this on a shoestring budget, and he's continuing to protect our rights as Americans.
Thank you so much, Andrew Arnheimer. Weev, really appreciate you fighting in the trenches. We need to get this law overturned. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, Abby. I appreciate you.
Coming up, I'll speak with a Seattle City Council member about the fight for $15 an hour minimum wage.
Nothing has been done this complex by the military since World War II.
This is, quite frankly, in historical terms, the Berlin airlift in reverse.
We've already seen a 747 go down at Bagram, some load shifting on takeoff, cause the aircraft to become unstable and fall.
You're talking really billions of dollars to move billions of dollars worth of equipment. At what point is the cost no longer worth the investment?
What are your thoughts on what's been going on in Washington?
Well, it's a mess, Larry. I mean, the whole country is being scoffed at and laughed at.
Enough is enough.
The media, the candidates, the corporatocracy, covering issues that actually affect you and me doesn't do too much for ad revenue.
Biotech agriculture giant takes on a 76-year-old American farmer based in Indiana.
How much fallout do you think this is going to create for the CIA? Do you think this is what's triggering the crisis?
America's the largest economy in the world. It's also the largest debtor nation in the history of the world.
Breaking the set is mostly about alternatives to the status quo, but one that gave real alternatives a voice.
One minute they were working toward the American dream, the next they were just trying to survive the night. It's time for Americans and lawmakers in Washington to wake up and start talking about the real causes of poverty in America.
All across the country, low-wage workers are mobilizing in the fight for a living wage. It's a struggle that's gaining momentum, especially in Seattle, where the city's first Socialist Council member, Kshama Sawant, has centered her platform around a campaign called the Fight for 15, a call to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And just this week, Sawant filed a charter amendment, which is the first step to bringing the issue to a vote. Earlier, I spoke to Sawant and first asked her why she has decided to make the Fight for 15 her #1 policy concern.
I think the overarching reality of the lives of working people, not just in Seattle, but everywhere in the nation, is the overwhelming race to the bottom that people are facing, the question of economic inequality, and the question of blatant injustice. You know, the whole idea of the Occupy movement was the banks that precipitated the financial collapse got bailed out, and the S&P 500 corporations are making historically high profits, whereas the rest of us are facing low-wage jobs, student debt, an epidemic of foreclosures. And in all this, you know, this sort of crucible of anger and frustration, the issue of $15 an hour has come to the forefront, and it has really encapsulated all those feelings of frustration against the political dysfunction, against the economic system, and everywhere working people, especially low-wage workers, are talking about the need for a decent wage. And Seattle has emerged as one of the main forefronts of this fight back. And you can see what impact this is having. This is not just in Seattle. Our 15 Now campaign, which was launched in Seattle, has now acquired national proportions. We've had chapters growing in many different cities. Many cities like Davis, like San Francisco, are talking about their own $15 minimum wage initiative.
It is definitely a national issue, Kshama. You've even compared the fight for minimum wage to same-sex marriage and marijuana legislation in the sense that it's very controversial. Why do you think it's so contentious?
It's contentious only because of the fact that in order to achieve something close to a living wage, we cannot do that by simply having nice conversations with big business and the super wealthy. It's not a question of asking them, you know, hey, can we have a conversation over coffee and talk about the need for a living wage for workers? No, the question of a living wage and the question of, you know, can we make sure that the people who make our cities run, the people who work hard every single day, providing child care, providing health care, providing other human services, you know, driving our school buses, serving our food, the question of all of these people getting something close to a living wage is not separate, but completely intertwined with the question of business profits. You know, where are these wages going to come from, and why have these wages remained so low?
Earlier this week, there was a pretty stunning news out of Oklahoma that the governor of the state, Mary Fallin, had signed a bill that prevents Oklahoma cities from establishing mandatory minimum wage laws. How do you think measures like these will affect the national picture here?
I think that the measure taken by the Oklahoma governor is a clear example, and I'm really glad you mentioned that. It's a clear example of how much of a threat the political and business establishment see this movement as, and they will take action. They will take actions like this. The National Restaurant Association is in full gear in Washington State, in Seattle. We know that tens of millions of dollars are being poured in Seattle against the $15 effort. And we know that big business and the super wealthy will be moving into action on this. And what I think the highlight should be of all of this is that we have to ramp up the movement. If you see governors and other political establishment people talking about clamping down on municipalities' right to do this, the signal it should send us is we have to start developing our movement. We have to really build the fight back, because that is the only thing that is going to pose a challenge to the business as usual.
Exactly. Let's talk about how the grassroots campaign will work. Earlier this week, the group filed a charter amendment to raise the Seattle minimum wage for big business employees to $15 an hour by January of next year. Can you detail exactly how the plan would work and how likely it is to become a reality?
The reason the charter amendment exists and why it was filed has everything to do with where the fault lines of this battle are moving. You know, business has lost the public debate on 15. They can no longer come out and say what they really want to say, which is they want their workers to continue at poverty wages. So the battle has moved from there to saying, okay, we're okay with 15, but let's carve this out and let's carve that out. Let's have tipped workers at a lower minimum wage. Let's count healthcare as wages. All of this are efforts to weaken the $15 effort and come up with a Swiss cheese 15, which is what we have to reject. And the only thing that will keep the city council and the city's political establishment on notice is to know that activists out there, low-wage workers out there are watching and are mobilizing.
Let's talk about small businesses. You've gotten some backlash from Seattle small businesses stating that you're ignoring their concerns and the ability to pay a $15 an hour minimum wage. How have you responded?
All throughout our campaign last year for City Council and since the day I took office, we've been emphatic that this system, this capitalist economy, does not work in the interests of small businesses. It favors the biggest conglomerates, the multinational corporations. It favors the Starbucks, the Boeings, the Microsofts, the Amazon.coms of this world. And this state, in Washington state, big business like Boeing and Microsoft pay negative tax rates if you count all the subsidies they get, while all the burden of running this state falls on the shoulders of working people and small businesses. So from day one, I have appealed to small businesses to join us in this fight against big business and demand that big business is taxed in order to create a subsidy for small businesses and nonprofits. I mean, Boeing got $9 billion in subsidies. I don't think the idea of a subsidy for small businesses should be that outlandish. But the reality is that no elected official or small business has joined me in this call to tax big business. And so on March 15th, I put forward a proposal that we should give a 3-year phase-in for small businesses and nonprofit human services. But big business should go to 15 right away because they have the full and complete ability to pay $15 an hour and not even make a slight dent in their profits. So we need small businesses to join us in our efforts, and I know that a few small businesses have joined 15 now in calling for a strong $15 measure. And I think that it's also incumbent upon us to have conversations with small business owners and explain that a lot of this fear-mongering that is engaged in by big business, by lobbyist organizations like the National Restaurant Association has no basis in reality. Every time the minimum wage was increased, it has been beneficial to the local economy, because when low-wage workers get a little bit of spending money in their pockets, they're going to spend it at local businesses.
Thank you so much for coming on. Shama Sawant, Seattle City Council member. If you're a frequent consumer of the corporate news, you may already think Hillary Clinton has wrapped up the 2016 Democratic presidential nomination. With her presumptive front-runner status well established comes a whole new level of scrutiny. For example, the Washington Post has examined the former Secretary of State's relationship with Boeing, the second largest defense contractor in the U.S. To discuss the details of that report, as well as Boeing's larger influence in Washington, RT political commentator Sam Sachs.
Hello.
What's up, Sam?
What's up?
What's going on? So let's dig a little bit more into the relationship between Hillary Clinton and Boeing. How did they help each other while she was at the State Department?
Well, looking at her tenure there, you see a lot of friendly deals between the two of them and what looked to be some quid pro quos. So Boeing wanted to sell over $3 billion in aircraft to a Russian airliner back in 2009. So Hillary Clinton, as the Secretary of State, went to Russia, and what she said, she made a shameless pitch for Rosavia, this Russian airliner, to buy these planes. And shortly after that pitch, we saw Boeing make a generous donation to the State Department of $2 million so that the State Department can move through with a pavilion for the United States at the coming up World's Fair in China. That $2 million donation, we know, according to the Washington Post reporting, raised a lot of ethical red flags at the State Department, whether or not they should accept this donation from a corporation, whether it looks like the State Department might be giving preferential treatment to Boeing. But someone within the State Department allowed it to go through anyways. We also know, based on the Post reporting, that in 2010, after that deal with Rosavia was inked and Boeing got those planes, made the deal to sell those planes to this Russian airliner, that Boeing made another generous donation of about $900,000 to the Clinton Foundation. That's, of course, Bill Clinton's foundation, which is also now run partly by Hillary Clinton since she's left the State Department. So you see a lot of these deals kind of being worked out while she was at the State Department, and it makes you wonder whether or not Boeing was receiving any more preferential treatment than other corporations that weren't as generous to Clinton causes.
Sure, but now that she has been out of the State Department for a little bit, do you think that we can expect the ties to continue?
Yeah, I think it's fairly obvious that they'll maintain close contact. Look, the Clinton political dynasty is among the most powerful in the country, and Boeing is the second most powerful defense contractor in the world. And it looks like Hillary is the front runner for president. So why wouldn't Boeing use the money it has and the influence that the Supreme Court has given corporations to go ahead and buy their candidate for 2016?
Why does Boeing love Hillary so much? Why are they so attracted to her as a candidate?
Well, Clinton represents the new Democratic wing of the party that her husband did as well, and that's these sort of corporatist Democrats. She's the senator from New York, friendly with Wall Street, friendly with corporate America. We know Boeing is engaging, and you had Shama Sawant on, who's been taking on Boeing in Washington State, which is trying to destroy unions and outsource labor. So they might have an ally for economic reasons in Hillary. But foreign policy-wise, I mean, I don't want to call Boeing this war profiteer, but they basically are. Like I said, they're the second largest defense contractor in the world, and they make money off of war, or at least the threat of war, to where people have to build up their military. And Hillary has supported all of President Obama's most hawkish actions, whether it was Libya. She supported strikes in Syria, and she supports the ever-growing drone campaign against Al-Qaeda and associated forces, which are all good for business.
I mean, I guess, we saw the banks and Wall Street backing Obama. Why not get Boeing on to back Hillary? They all got to pick their corporation, their favorite industry to back them up. Talk about Boeing's grip on Washington beyond Hillary.
Yeah, well, one way to look at them taking interest in Hillary is not to gain new power in Washington, but to maintain the power they already have. They spent $15 million lobbying Congress last year. Most of that money went to Senator Dick Durbin, the chair of the powerful Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, which handles the purse strings for the Pentagon, meaning they handle the purse strings for a lot of defense contracts. The second leading recipient was Lindsey Graham, notorious war hawk. And we know that President Obama has relied heavily on Boeing to boost exports. He said he's the company's top pitchman, and he deserves a gold watch when he's out of term. So, they're trying to get the next person in the White House at this point.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sam Sachs. Yep. And that's our show, you guys. I'm back tomorrow. Break the set all over again. From 1,800 federal policies enacted between 1981 and 2002, and empirically concluded that national laws and regulations overwhelmingly align with the preference of the economic elite. And that was back in 2002. Hilariously, it took another elite institution, Princeton, to come up with this obvious conclusion. But hey, I guess the Ivy League school finally started to listen to Dr. Cornel West. Now let's break the set.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
What's poppin', people? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. Well, we've got some breaking news at the top of the show. Turns out that U.S. government represents the interests of the rich and powerful, not the majority of Americans. Now, I know this may come as shocking news to you, but a joint study released last week by Princeton and Northwestern University made it official. The U.S. is indeed an oligarchy. The two authors of the study went through an enormous amount of data on student borrowers. See, the student loan behemoth has been the target of a federal investigation and lawsuit stemming from violations of borrowers' rights. But the probe wasn't limited to federal student loans. In fact, the investigation found evidence that Sallie Mae cheated active duty members of the military as well by providing them loans at illegally high interest rates. And if you've ever seen the PR machine of military recruitment, you know that cheap education is a huge selling point.
This is an acceptance letter. It's a diploma.
And once again, we put something on the air. It's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait. Do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire and tone. These words are hard hitting, you watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set. Breaking the set. Breaking the set.
This month, the U.S. Congressional Budget Office announced their prediction that could spell major profits for the Department of Education over the next 10 years. $127 billion to be exact. It's a forecast based largely upon the interest on student loans, which are also expected to rise starting next year. While it's not exactly clear how much the rates will increase, the profit from federal student loans calls into question another important story. The Department of Education renewing its contract with Sallie Mae, America's largest student loan provider with about 5.8 million former and current